black voter turnout helped President Trump flip some key battleground states back in 2016. So will this election be any different with a black woman on the Democratic ticket? MSNBC correspondent Garrett Haake spoke with black female voters in Wisconsin about Biden-Harris 2020.
Allison, Wisconsin was one of the closest fought battleground states in 2016. Donald Trump won it by less than a percentage point. This as black turnout here in Milwaukee County fell off a cliff. Now Democrats are trying to find a way to bring those voters back into the fold.
Watching Kamala Harris make history last week beside Joe Biden led Milwaukee grandmother Denise Calloway to take her own big first step, volunteering for a campaign for the first time ever.
That pick really put something on your heart.
Oh my gosh, in a way I didn't really expect. I mean, if I'm being honest, when I saw her walk out with him, I teared up. I cried. It is a moment in history that I don't know that I expected to see.
It's African-American voters like Calloway who've helped Democrats win Wisconsin year after presidential year, from 1988 until Donald Trump won the state by less than 1 percentage point in 2016. Black turnout in Milwaukee County that year shrank 19%. Small business owner Terrence Collins voted for Barack Obama twice, then stayed home in 2016.
To me, it was like picking evil against evil. It was kind of like, so it was like, I'm going to kind of sit this one out because I really didn't like neither one. But now, looking back, I wish I would have voted for Hillary.
27-year-old Tempest Booker has never cast a ballot for president.
Are you more engaged this time? Are you paying?
Absolutely, I am. I feel like my vote counts because the police brutality with our black men, something needs to be done because I have boys.
The fight for equality and against police violence came up again and again in our conversations with voters here.
Everybody's woke now. Everybody gets to see what we've endured or we've been going through for so many years. And being part of the solution is getting out and voicing your opinion and getting your vote out there.
Terrell Martin has been a Democratic activist since the 1980s.
How does Joe Biden take that energy and use it to help get elected?
We have all those issues in the city of Milwaukee, unemployment. So he has to address those issues that the young people are looking for in order to be elected.
Calloway told me that the Harris pick is evidence Biden is listening and will address those issues, and she intends to help him get the chance.
It's very important that as African-American women, we mobilize. Because there's one thing that African-American women have learned about when someone is the first. And that is that we all need to rally around that person who's the first so we can make sure there's a second and a third.
The Trump campaign isn't seeding the black vote here in Milwaukee County. They opened a Black Voices for Trump office downtown. They are not trying to win the black vote in Milwaukee County, but in a state as close as Wisconsin is expected to be in November, every single vote, even at the margins, counts. Allison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.